Hello, everyone. Welcome in Machine Learning in Behavioral Economics stream facilitated by ACE. Today, we have an interesting work, which is a cognitive model priors for predicting human decisions. My name is Jiri. I'm a data scientist, and this is a new stream for ACE, which I had the pleasure to launch. And ACE is a profounded community of machine learning practitioners who have gathered around topics in AI research, engineering, and products. We host free live sessions like this 3 to 5 times a week and produce premium content in variable subject areas. To see more, visit our website, ai.science, and log in to access the slides from this and other sessions. I would like to introduce you David Bourgin. David is a machine learning engineer at Spotify based in New York, and he's also a graduate student research of UC Berkeley and holds PhD in cognitive sciences. In his research, David combines machine learning with psychology, and besides other interests, other achievements, David also has an experience of integrating cognitive models to build a recommender system. So David, thank you for joining us, and I'm passing my word to you.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, I'm David, and today I'm going to be talking about some work my colleagues and I did on combining behavioral models from economics and psychology with approaches from machine learning. So having accurate predictive models of human behavior is important across a number of different applied and theoretical disciplines. In economics, we're interested in understanding consumer behavior and public choice. In psychology, we're interested in understanding the conditions that produce behavior and developing explanatory models of them. In artificial intelligence, we're interested in building agents that are compatible with human beings and which are able to infer the things that people hold important and valuable. And in business and marketing, we're interested in matching users with products or ads that they're most likely to consume or enjoy. So in each of these, across sort of each of these settings, there are broadly sort of two historical approaches that one could take for building such a predictive model. In the first, which I associate primarily with the behavioral sciences, we can observe the behavior within a controlled setting, often an in-lab experiment, or sometimes something like an A/B test, in order to gather behavioral data and then combine it with existing scientific theories of the phenomena under study in order to build an explicit model of human behavior and cognition. So in economics, a really sort of notable example of this is prospect theory, which won Daniel Kahneman the Nobel Prize. More recently, we've been seeing more and more approaches that leverage machine learning, which is sort of a different perspective on model building. In the machine learning approach, we sort of skip building any explicit theory of the behavior that we are trying to model, and instead just do a search in function space for the best function that fits the available behavioral data. So an appealing property of this machine learning approach is its flexibility. So in particular, as the amount of training data grows, so does the predictive accuracy of these machine learning models. And this is one of the reasons that we see sort of so much investment in machine learning across a lot of industrial applications. One of the reasons for this is that the optimization that these models are performing, often some variant of gradient descent, is completely generic. It doesn't matter what the particular problem you're trying to solve is, as long as you can pose it within a framework that can be fit with some of these machine learning approaches, you can churn that SGD crank, and as you get more data, you can leverage it. The downside, unfortunately, with some of these models is that in having such expressive capacity, they often really struggle to generalize well when data is scarce. So probably all of us have had the experience where we have a relatively small sample of data we throw sort of an overpowered or overparameterized neural network at it, and it immediately overfits. So we get very good training loss, but whenever we look at another sample out of sample data, we do very poorly. And this is particularly an issue for predicting behavior, in part because in economics and psychology, traditionally, most behavioral data sets are things that have been collected by hand. That is, scientists, often graduate students, are running people in labs, more recently over MTurk, with limited funding in order to collect enough behavioral data to create a training set for these models. And this is one of the reasons, I argue, that we haven't seen more applications of machine learning in some of these fields, whereas in sort of larger, more applied settings, machine learning has really taken off. In contrast, theoretical models sort of suffer from the opposite problem. So these hand-tuned theory-based models are able to fit much, much smaller data sets, often the size of the things that you might collect in lab, since the theories that they're based on provides a natural source of inductive bias. It limits the scope of the possible functions that it's looking over to just things that are likely to be useful in predicting behavior. The downside, though, is that they can't capitalize on increased data set sizes in the same way that a machine learning model can. These explicit theories are much more, or these explicit models run into a problem where after a certain point, in order to produce better performance, you kind of have to improve the theory. And improving theory is very, very tough. So we have kind of like this trade-off, right? In fact, it's sort of well codified. This is effectively the bias variance trade-off. But what we'd really like to do is to be able to get the benefits of both approaches, right? So to be able to have a more or less generic model, which we can optimize sort of with a blind optimization strategy, or I should say generic optimization, not blind, but which is still able to provide reasonable generalization performance on smaller data sets. So in the talk today, I'm going to discuss one approach to achieving this effect, which we refer to in our paper as cognitive model priors. So the general intuition behind this approach is as follows. We're going to use an existing theoretical model, cognitive model here, as a data generator. So when I say cognitive model, I'm being sort of purposefully vague. I'm actively not. I think for our purposes, we can think of a cognitive model as any mapping between sort of the input environmental conditions to behavior. And one of the claims I'm going to make is that taking this generic view allows us to be very, very flexible in the condition in the sort of places that we can apply this cognitive model prior approach. The general idea is we're going to take a behavioral model, I should say cognitive model here, and we're going to put thousands of sort of artificially generated input problems, either from sampling from some parametric problem space or some other generative procedure. We're going to put that through the cognitive model in order to generate a large collection of synthetic behavioral data. So what we have now is, in some sense, an enormous training data set that encodes the inductive bias, or sort of the insights of this cognitive model. We're going to take this synthetic behavioral data set and use it to pre-train a model for machine learning. So what we're doing is we're taking the synthetic data set generated in step 1, and we're going to take a off-the-shelf neural network and use it to predict that synthetic behavioral data using the same inputs that we gave to our cognitive model. So in some sense, you can think of this as transferring the inductive bias, the sort of theoretical insights that were present in this behavioral or cognitive model in an explicit form into a more implicit form, say sort of weights, in this neural network using the sort of language of data, right? The one sort of lingua franca here that both of these models share is that they're both trained on this training data set. So in this step, we basically train the neural network to mimic the cognitive model, right? Yes, go ahead.
Can I have a question? So
Absolutely.
in essence, the cognitive model here works as a sampling technique, like a measure it over sampling technique that just generates the data.
That's right. That's right. It's a biased data generator. So we are treating it as, you can kind of think of it as like it's very expensive to collect real human data. So instead of doing that, what's the next best thing we can do? Well, the next best thing we can do is use our best approximation to that in a sort of a bootstrapping sense. We have this model which we can generate the synthetic behavior. We know it's not true behavior, but we can use it as an initialization. We can use it to sort of get our network in a reasonable place and then begin to improve upon that in the next step.
And how can we make sure that we will not create or destroy any important data distribution in the human, in the real data collected in a lab?
Yeah, that's a superb question, and the answer is there's no guarantee. Unfortunately, if the distribution of behavior produced by your cognitive model, if your cognitive model is not very good, you run the risk. And I'll get into this a little bit more in a few slides, but you run the risk of things like catastrophic forgetting, where you train a network on data from one distribution and then try to fine tune it with data drawn from a different distribution. And all of a sudden, all of the insights that you had from the first distribution are kind of washed out. So this is absolutely a concern. I think there are ways to reduce the chances that happens. But there's no strong guarantee here that you can always do this. I think in some sense it's really going to depend on the quality of your initial behavioral model.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So just to recap, at this stage, what we have is a neural network which is reproducing the behavior of, or sort of ideally arbitrarily reproducing the behavior of this behavioral model. In the final step, what we're going to do is we're going to take this very expensive sort of human data, like these tiny data sets that we have, and we're going to use that to fine tune the existing network with the hope that we can actually improve over the initial cognitive model because we can use this generic optimization strategy in mini batch SGD. So again, what's going on here is we're taking the network that we trained in step 2, using that as the initialization for a new network, and then say dropping the learning rate significantly and training on a very small amount of additional real human data to see if we can eke out better performance over this initial behavioral model. So in essence, this is a very straightforward approach. We're really not doing anything particularly sophisticated here. All we're doing is recognizing that we can move between the more explicit sort of theoretical representation or sort of structured representation of a particular model and the more implicit or black box representation using by using sort of the language of data. And because we can do that sort of translation, we can now begin to take advantage of the unique sort of properties of the sort of explicit model and the more black box machine learning approach. Okay, so this is the approach. The real question is, like, does it work, right?
Does it?
Sorry, was there a question?
No. I was just
yeah.
repeating your question.
Yeah, right. The real question is, like, yeah, can you do anything with it? So I'm going to discuss one case study that my collaborators and I looked at, where we used this approach in the domain of human risky choice behavior. So risky choice is sort of a classic problem in sort of modern economics. This is models from this domain underlie a great deal of sort of advances in agent-based modeling. It's what Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for. Prospect theory is a notable example. And because of that, we have very good theoretical models that we can work with here. So the general risky choice scenario is as follows. Subjects come in and they're asked to choose between two different gambles. So the goal, and at the end of the experiment, once we've collected this training data, the goal of our model is going to be able to predict the rates with which, on average, people choose each of these different gambles as a function of the different parameters of the gambles. So in this case, a gamble is represented in sort of the most straightforward way you could imagine. So in particular, what the subject sees is a collection of rewards along with the associated outcome probability of that reward occurring. The subject will select one or the other gamble, and upon selection, a reward is sampled from that outcome distribution and added to the subject's cumulative earnings. The subject receives feedback about which reward they got, in addition to seeing the reward they could have gotten had they chosen the other gamble. And this is sort of an important theoretical construct. There are a number of studies that show that people act in ways that try to minimize this regret, the difference between their current selection and the what they could have had. So, and at the very end of the experiment, after they've completed some number of these gambles, the subjects will receive a real compensation that is proportional to their cumulative earnings. So this is to incentivize them not just to select gambles at random, but to really pay attention and try to choose the thing they believe is going to give them the best outcome. So that's the risky choice paradigm. It turns out that again, there are sort of a number of different models that have been proposed in the literature for trying to model how people behave in these situations. One of the sort of major insights of the last 50 years is that people deviate from sort of a rational actor in sort of reliable ways when faced with problems like this. So in particular, a rational agent would just say, take the expected utility of each gamble and take the gamble that has the highest expected utility. And utility here is kind of like in the simplest way is just defined as the actual monetary or the value of the particular reward. Indeed, we know from a number of different behavioral experiments that people don't always do this. And so theoreticians have come up with more and more sophisticated ways to try to model their behavior. The general sort of framework that exists within is that they assume that people assign some sort of subjective value to the particular gambles themselves. And that subjective value is some function of the objective properties of that gamble, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a linear function. It could, it could be all sorts of different things. then after applying that calculating a subjective value for each gamble, participants are going to choose the gamble with the highest value in that sort of psychological space. Even within this framework, there are sort of a number of different approaches where you can sort of remap both the rewards associated with the gambles. You can weight the probabilities associated with the objective probabilities of the gambles, et cetera, et cetera. For our purposes, we had the advantage of being able to kind of cherry pick the best model from 2 recent international choice prediction competitions. So it turns out that for the last 5 years, there have been a number of competitions that have very graciously made a collection of human selection frequencies on a number of different gambling problems available in sort of a style like Kaggle, where researchers can submit models, and on a sort of unseen test set, the models will be evaluated, and you can rank their performance. So when we started to work on this paper, the model that had the best predictive performance on these choice prediction competitions is a model called BEAST. And BEAST is an acronym. It stands for Best Estimate and Sampling Tools. And the citation is in the bottom right. It's a fairly complex model. The general intuition is that it estimates its predictions based on both the objective expected value of a gamble as well as a collection of sort of biased sample-based estimators, sort of capturing this idea that people may be performing sort of Monte Carlo mental simulations when they are trying to calculate the subjective value of a gamble. I don't have time, and I'm also just not the best person to explain like the true inner workings of BEAST. But the point I want to emphasize here is that it's actually one of the values of the cognitive model prior approach that I don't necessarily have to understand exactly what BEAST is doing in order to use it. For our method to work, we can just use this as a black box, a data generator of inputs to outputs. And this means that sort of people who are not experts in behavioral economics can still come in and leverage this approach for their own. Okay, so we've got this cognitive model, BEAST, and now we can use it to generate an enormous synthetic data set. So we went ahead and generated an enormous collection of artificial gambling problems. And we did that by using a sort of parametric representation of each gamble. Turns out that this was already sort of done for us. The choice prediction competition had already developed a generative process for this, which we could reuse. It had 12 different objective features. And we can uniformly sample from that problem space. So we can do this as long as we want. So generate as many problems as we like. And then we will feed those problems to the BEAST model. The BEAST model is going to spit out its predictions on the rates with which people are going to choose each gamble. And we can use that now as a training data set when we pre-train our neural network. So
can I have a question?
Yeah, please.
So if you go to the previous slide, so as I understand it, then point number 1, we can represent a human choice, like a gamble, a choice between A or B, as a 12-dimensional vector, right? One single decision.
I wouldn't say the decision. I would say that the problem itself can be represented as a 12-dimensional vector. So I would, like, for example, if I go back here, I have, again, I choose between gamble A or B, and that entire problem, that is all the information about, the reward and the probability of the reward for gamble A, and all the information about the rewards and the probability of the rewards for gamble B can be encoded as a single 12-dimensional vector. but it doesn't
I
tell me
see.
how people are going to perform on it.
I see. I see. So this particular gamble is the 12-dimensional vector itself.
That's correct.
That's
Yep.
correct. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So what we have here is this: we generate a huge collection of these 12-dimensional, vectors, and we can then deterministically reproduce the actual gamble problem that they correspond to. We can give that gamble problem as an input to Beast, and Beast is going to say, okay, well, I predict that, N% of humans will choose gamble B on this particular problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way we come up with a training data set where the input features are just these 12-dimensional vectors, and the output are the Beast predictions for that gamble. So we're in our case.
So are we having a classification problem here?
I would say so. Right. Yeah. So it's a logistic regression problem in some way, right? Like you would have some sort of logistic output training with log likelihood. In our case, it turns out that because we're predicting values between 0 and 1 probabilities, right? The choice prediction competition used for their final metric, they used mean squared error. So we report here the mean squared error rather than the log likelihood of the data. It turns out that if you change the objective function to log likelihood, or binary cross hypertrophy, the model performs the same. But in future plots, you may see MSE and may wonder why that is. That's just for consistency with the benchmarks that we are comparing against.
Okay.
Thanks. Sure. So I won't spend too much time on this in particular, but we used maybe the thing to emphasize here is that our choice of neural network was pretty generic. Like we didn't choose a very large network. We chose really, actually a quite small network with only 3 hidden layers for the prediction model. And we also did it in such a way that the network was enforced. We enforced that the network should be sparse, so that it wasn't fully connected between layers. And the reason we did this is because we knew that during this fine-tuning step, we were not going to have a great deal of data. And having more and more parameters within this sort of increases the risk that we're going to overfit. So we really wanted to reduce the number of parameters as much as we could in order to still as sort of like as a form of regularization here. So to that end, we used this sparse evolutionary training, which is, described in the box. It's not particularly important here. In fact, we've done a version of this where we did use a fully connected network, and it still outperforms a number of the other models. It just so happens that if you can add in that additional regularization by enforcing sparseness, it tends to help. So this is the network that we would pre-train on these this synthetic behavioral data. So we can now that we've pre-trained this model, we can then fine-tune on the actual test sets from these choice prediction competitions. And the thing to keep in mind here is that these test sets in ML standards are sort of minuscule. They're like, if you were to create like a Kaggle competition with some of this data, people would laugh at you. So in particular, like the test set in these competitions consisted of 60 problems, and the training set was only 210 problems. So they were really, really quite tiny. And so one of the first things we looked at is like how just these generic off-the-shelf like machine learning approaches perform on this kind of data set. And unsurprisingly, they do pretty poorly, right? Because we know that in conditions where they don't have a lot of data, they're very, very prone to overfitting. In contrast, again, sort of unsurprisingly, some of the theoretical models that are based on sort of insights from psychological and economic theory fared significantly better because they have that sort of inductive bias. We then compared sort of some feature engineering approaches. And in fact, in 2018, we actually won the competition just by incorporating more sophisticated features as input to the sort of a generic machine learning approach. So that's all to say that sort of up until now, that's really how machine learning, a lot of machine learning in the behavioral sciences has been done, is that you develop sort of, hand-tuned kind of features which encode a great deal of information often, and which often require a great deal of domain level knowledge to develop in order to apply the neural network. If we compare that to using this cognitive model prior approach, which operated directly on just those 12-dimensional features, the sort of objective properties of the gamble, no sort of hand tuning, no additional psychological theory involved, it is significantly better than all of the other models that we evaluated for both, on both of the competition data sets. Mm-hmm. So that was really exciting for us. But I think one of the things that we sort of know as both scientists and sort of machine learning practitioners is just that, like that, the obsession with just driving down a loss function is not necessarily like it can often mask sort of interesting and important properties of particular models. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is, after getting this result, which was sort of encouraging, is to try to characterize the conditions under which a model like this would really perform well. And in order to do that, we went ahead and we were very fortunate to get a grant, which allowed us to collect an enormous amount of actual human behavioral judgments on a collection of about 13,000 choice prediction gamble selection problems here.
This data set was the data set outside of the competition.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay, I get it.
Yes. So this data set is after the competition. We said, gee, it would be really, really nice to try to understand the way that this approach interacts with data scarcity. Right now, we really only know how it does when we have effectively no data. But it would be really cool to be able to look at how it changes as a function as the amount of data increases. But in order to do that, we needed more data. So we developed this very large data set. And sort of that was useful in the context of this particular study. But in general, I think one of the things we really hope, so we plan to release this data set so that other people can use it. And one of the things that we really hope is that in having data at this scale, we can help to encourage other approaches to other sort of machine learning approaches to behavioral prediction in a lot of the sciences. So I think that's been one of the major hurdles before, and we're hoping that this can be one step towards that. Just to give you a sense of like why this data set was important for us, what I've done here is I've projected that 12-dimensional objective feature space into a 2D plot using t-SNE or something, it was t-SNE. And the X's here represent gamble problems that sort of in the literature have been historically very important in the sense that they have illustrated particular deviations from that humans have from expected utility. The blue dots here now represent all of the problems that were included in the previous choice prediction competitions. So you see that it sort of they have a number of the historic gambles as well as some new gambles. The black dots here now represent the coverage of our new data set. So one of the really valuable things here, we think, is that it has a much more sort of uniform coverage of the space of possible problems to allow us to do real exploration into sort of human behavioral responses, not just on sort of hand-picked examples, but sort of across a much, much wider problem space. So all of that was to say, this data set, I think, can be very, very valuable outside of this particular study. But in the context of the cognitive model priors approach, the real value here is just its scale, that it is so much larger than the previous benchmarks. And one of the things that we can do with it now is to begin to compare how this approach works under different levels of data scarcity. So what we're looking at here is the validation error loss of a randomly initialized neural network as a function of different proportions of this overall data set. So it starts at 1% of the full data set, and it goes all the way to the full data set. And unsurprisingly, what we see is that sort of as we increase the amount of data, the network can become, get much, much better predictions fairly quickly. The question is, how does that compare to something like a network with this cognitive model prior on it? And what we see sort of is that if we plot the validation error for this cognitive model prior approach, we see that when data is very, very scarce, the difference in validation loss between a randomly initialized model and this cognitive model prior approach is quite large. But unsurprisingly, that narrows and narrows and narrows until by the time we get to the full data set, these models are performing effectively the same way. And that sort of mimics our intuition, as a proper Bayesian, we know that, the influence of a prior on the overall sort of posterior density is going to be the most pronounced when you only have a few observations. As you get more and more and more data, the likelihood is going to eventually overwhelm that prior, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. Additionally, we can look at sort of the how much time it takes us to get to a particular level of performance. So again, what we're plotting the validation MSE for a randomly initialized network here. But now on the x-axis, what we have is, instead of the proportion of the data set, we have the epoch number, the amount of time, training time. So we're training on the full data set here, and we just want to see, how quickly do we achieve a particular error. And what we see here is that with this cognitive model prior approach, again, almost immediately on the second epoch, because of this initialization, the pre-training, it's able to achieve a loss that's quite close to its loss after, say, 60 iterations. So we have drastically, a fraction of the overall training time for a randomly initialized network. We can get the same loss with this pre-training. So I think that I'm running out of time here, but the general takeaway here is that in conditions where data is scarce or there is is expensive to get, this approach to incorporating cognitive model priors can improve both the predictive accuracy as well as reduce training time for models of human behavior. So I have a couple of outstanding questions, but before we get to that, I just want to thank my co-authors, Joshua Peterson, Daniel Reichman, Stuart Russell, and Tom Griffiths, and our funding sources. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, David, very much. That was very interesting work. I am glad that you agreed to attend and present your work today, because I introduced it slightly, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So thank you for that. And I actually have one question I didn't ask you during your presentation, because I was answering to online questions. But there was a question regarding letter K. Well, and if you go few slides back, where are the results in the table? Back.
Oh,
here, even before, there was a letter key, and the question was whether it's a hyperparameter or not. Yeah.
in the evolutionary training.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. This is a hyperparameter of the network. That's correct. If you want more details on this, there's a very nice and short Nature Communications paper. This Mokanau et al. Is where they introduce this, and there's actually a very nice implementation that you can look at to see the details here.
And seeing this slide, I recall that in your paper you said that you don't consider the graph network here to bring any substantial improvements, but still you use it, right?
So this is not a graph network in the sense that, like, we're not operating on any sort of like structured representation here.
Okay.
I think graph networks in general, there's sort of like an appealing property there, which is that they incorporate sort of there's sort of an intermediate step between these like fully structured sort of like very kind of inflexible theoretical models and the very flexible but often kind of unstructured neural networks approach. So they get sort of like some structure learning in there, but we haven't applied them to this problem.
Yeah, because I recall that there was a set algorithm in your model architecture.
Oh yes. SET is an acronym here, and that stands for sparse evolutionary training.
Okay, I get it. Okay,
yes, yes. Okay, yeah. So the clarification is we're not actually operating on sets here. We are using a training, this evolutionary training, which happens to be named SET.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the clarification. I don't see any questions, any more questions online here. However, I still have a few of them, like because I'm curious. So you said that Beast is a black box model.
Well, I think it's for our purposes, it's a black box model. It's definitely not in the sense that it's very explicitly described in, for example, the Arav et al. Paper, and it's developed based on very explicit theory, but we're treating it in our particular case as a black box model in the sense that we don't. To use it, we didn't have to understand what it was doing.
Oh, okay. Because when I didn't go through the code, but since it's available on the competition website, I kind of expected that it's a hard code, that there are some hard-coded functions.
That's right. Yes, that's right. And it has a collection of hyperparameters that are fit, but in general, it is a collection of samplers basicly.
Okay, and so is that a way how usually a cognitive model works? That is a hard-coded set of functions.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and the answer is it really runs the gamut. So I think in psychology, the approach to modeling behavior really sort of follows the same trajectory as what we've seen in AI, where initially you would start with sort of propositional logic production system style models, which are very inflexible, and people realized very quickly that was insufficient for the sort of flexibility that we need for modeling behavior. Since then, people have explored sort of more these connectionist or neural network approaches where there's no explicit sort of like symbols that you can look into the model and see what's going on, but it seems to have a reasonable fit to human behavior. There's also a very sort of strong probabilistic modeling community that is sort of outgrowth of the sort of rationalist approach to modeling, which uses sort of often modern Bayesian methods for modeling behavior. So in general, there are a number, there in the same way that there are many different ways to do machine learning. There are many different approaches to cognitive modeling. In behavioral economics, there's been this very strong push for, the prospect theory has been incredibly influential. And many of the models that exist for human risky choice are sort of variations on that. Beast is sort of an interesting example because it actually took a bit of it still uses principles from that are sort of that come from prospect theory, but it actually in using these sample-based approaches, it makes a real deviation from that paradigm.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And also, I see a question from the online audience. Would you have any idea how this approach could be applied to something like image classification or some high-level decision processes?
Yeah. I mean, so I think like the general idea here is sort of a broadly. I think it's broadly applicable in the sense that like really the limiting reagent is your ability and access to a good psychological or sort of behavioral model of like what people do in a particular domain. So one of the nice things about vision is that like human visual perception has been like very, very well studied. It's sort of like it's a very active area of sort of like psychological work. And so there are often quite good models for certain sorts of visual tasks. If you have a particular phenomenon or behavioral phenomenon that you are interested in modeling here. So, for example, I'm not a vision scientist, so I'm probably going to come up with a very contrived example, but like, for example, there are like confusability, like say you want to understand like when two images are similar, like psychologically, like a person thinks two images are similar. That's a very difficult problem generally, and there exist psychological models that attempt to understand that. If you can take that psychological model and use that within the cognitive model prior approach, I think there's the potential to be able to use it within a sort of image classification or maybe an image similarity system, search by image or reverse image search kind of thing.
Interesting.
Hopefully that's at least like a thread for something like
that. Yeah. And again, I could have like dozens of questions because this is really interesting. But since we also have a stream for recommender systems, and you are a machine learning engineer at Spotify, I really wanted to ask you if such approach can be used and specifically in a recommender system. Yeah,
I mean, I think like
how would you frame it?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are a lot of ways that you can frame it. I think like for me, so I've actually done a little bit of work on this that is not part of Spotify that I can talk about. That looks at recommendation as a problem of sort of like as the analog of a psychological problem of generalization. So this is the problem that every kid who learns a language has to solve, where a parent shows them a glass and they say that's a glass, and the kid then has to go into the world and say, okay, what other things are glasses? So they have to somehow abstract what are the definitive properties of a glass and use that to identify new things. In recommendation, the task is somebody listened to these 3 songs. What other songs are they going to listen to? You can think of those 3 songs as sort of an example of some new category reflecting that person's tastes, and you now need to generalize that way. So that under that sort of approach, you can say, well, what sorts of psychological models of generalization exist, and can we use those in the context of recommendation to provide more sort of a closer match to human behavioral responses in in recommendation. So again, remember that this is an approach that's sort of targeted towards better predicting the way people will do a thing. And that sometimes aligns with like business goals, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, it's not immediately clear whether you want a recommender system that mimics the way people recommend, or maybe there's a better way to recommend and that people aren't that good at it, and that we shouldn't necessarily treat people as the gold standard here. I think that's, you know, in some sense like that's a question that you have to investigate. I think there's interesting evidence to suggest that in a number of conditions, people really do prefer human recommendations, but I think that it's not a foregone conclusion in any case. But insofar as they do, you could say apply some of these models within as the sort of baseline cognitive model within a cognitive model prior approach.
Yes, because I was, you know, I'm also in a recommender system, and I was thinking about something similar because imagine a recommender system when you get exposed to personalized list of items, but it's still, you know, of size of hundreds of them, maybe. For example, it would be a Netflix. And I personally feel that every time I make a decision what item I will watch or what item I will buy, it's, for me, it's also a gamble, right? Because I may like it and I may waste my time, right? So I was thinking about like incorporating this idea into a solution such that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a very rich literature of both these sort of treating it as a sequential problem, these explore-exploit trade-offs, but also trying to integrate sort of human behavioral functions to better match, like on a user modeling side, how people will value particular items.
And David, have you noticed a recent intention or recent attempts to actually use something like you did, generating synthetic data sets on human data, where when it's maybe too expensive to collect human data, do you see intentions to use machine learning methods or
yeah, so I think
other models?
You know, there's been a lot of interest in synthetic data and sort of simulated data. You know, we're nowhere close to the first people to have used this approach. I mean, in some sense, like this is what statisticians have been doing for ages, and in sort of as you know, bootstrap approaches. We're just having to use, you know, cognitive models rather than sort of, you know, other kinds of models. The integration of like explicit cognitive models, I think that's more limited in many cases because cognitive models have been less accessible to practitioners, you know, in the field. Like I think a lot of right now, in order to be able to leverage a cognitive model, you have to know where to look and where to find that model and how to get it and things like that. And I don't think in a lot of ways we haven't been, you know, the ML community is way ahead of us here, where there's, you know, you can import sklearn and now you have, you know, just a bevy of models at your disposal. There's no such thing like that in cognitive science yet, and I think that's been one of the hurdles and one of the reasons that perhaps some of these more psychological models haven't been as explored as much.
Yeah, so, that's interesting, and luckily, therefore, there exists an intersection of behavioral economics and machine learning. So you can try to bring develop solutions to these hurdles.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's a very exciting time to be
definitely.
Yeah.
So David, thank you very much for your time and your efforts to present. I highly appreciate it. And for whoever has been watching us, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, ML Papers Explained, to get notified about all the live sessions and other free content we publish. We currently have about 14 different streams that are focused on various machine learning topics. And this session is machine learning in behavioral economics stream. So I hope you enjoyed it and come back. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Good night.